but no amount of success, no perfect relationship, no house on the beach is ever going to be enough. Most of my suffering in life has come because I've never believed that I'm enough. Do whatever work is necessary to feel comfortable as you are and live the life you feel you are meant to live, not for your mom, not for your dad, not for your teacher. The consciousness of a business can only be at the height of the consciousness of the leader.
Hi, this is Ariane, and welcome to another episode of The Spirit Collective, where I talk to remarkable people about a side of their lives they rarely talk about, their spiritual path. It's time for a different conversation. There's a specific human story that we don't tell very well. The story of arriving. The story of getting the thing, the relationship, the life, the business, building it, scaling it, becoming known for it, getting the money and the fame for it, and then sitting one day with all of it and realizing that whatever it was you thought you were going to feel, you don't. Blake Mycoskie is one of the most articulate people I know of that story. He spent his 20s building companies, and at 29 on a trip to Argentina, he met a woman handing out shoes to children who didn't have any. He came home and started TOMS shoes, which we all know. Sell one, give one was the simplest spiritual business idea ever. By the time he sold it, he'd given away 100 million pairs of shoes and built a $650 million company. That is the story we know, but this is not going to be a conversation about TOMS. Blake will tell you it was probably never really about the shoes. Once the shoes had been given and the success had his name on it, the emptiness and the depression arrived. What followed has become one of the most amazing spiritual journeys of any modern entrepreneur, which is why I'm so excited to have him on this podcast today. Plant medicine ceremonies, a wellness company called Made For. He now has a new foundation called Enough about self-worth and a new podcast called No Magic Pill. Blake and I met at TED this year. What struck me about him was definitely not his resume. It was how openly he was holding it all, on stage, in front of thousands of people, the success, the unraveling, the depression, the rebuilding, and the not yet knowing. He was a man very visibly in his heart and pursuing not his ego's agenda anymore, but his soul agenda. Blake, it's such a pleasure to welcome you to the Spirit Collective.
Oh, what a beautiful introduction. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Describes you perfectly.
Oh.
So your TED Talk this year was probably one of the most magical, memorable, remarkable ones, at least for me. I can tell you also I've been wearing my Enough bracelet. See, I've got a little collection, right?
I know you have it, but it looks great with all your other ones. I love it.
It pops. It's the first one I see next to all of them. So I just, we'll talk about that in a second. Before we dive in, I want to ask you, what is the word that you use to refer to life, God, the universe, source, energy, consciousness? Is there a word, or are they kind of all interchangeable?
They're really all interchangeable to me. I mean, one of my favorite words is the Hebrew word for breath. I forget what it is, I think, but that is often referred to also as God, as just breath. And I think that's something over the years that has really stuck with me, because sometimes it really is as simple as taking one deep breath to reconnect to spirit.
Yeah, I always think, when you go, the quickest way from your head to your heart is like the elevator is through the breath.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it's what is bestowed upon all humans. So whether we think we're spiritual or not, I think with the breath, we know that we're all connected to something.
Yeah. And then speaking of that, there's one of my favorite authors is a guy named Rob Bell. I don't know if you've ever read any of his books, but he has a book and the title is Everything is Spiritual. And it's one of the best books I've ever read about spirituality. And so I highly recommend that book.
I'll definitely, we'll put that in the show notes. I love that we're still on a journey where we can recommend new books to each other.
Yeah, it's great.
So Blake, while I was preparing this, one of the things I read on your website was that through every venture, Blake has remained guided by spiritual principles. That's what's on your website.
Yeah, of course.
That's a pretty rare sentence for an entrepreneur. It's a pretty rare sentence, I think, even for a man. And it's a
Sure.
rare sentence to sort of come out that much and actually plant a flag to have merged really your business ventures with your spirituality. I
Yeah.
think a lot of people struggle between it's sort of one foot in each world and it feels like two separate things. So
Yeah.
how do you merge your business ventures with spirituality?
Yeah, it's interesting. That question reminds me of my favorite quote by Chateaubriand, and it's about the art of living. And at the end of it's a long monologue he gives, but at the end of it, he says, to the master of living, it's either play nor recreation, and he goes back and forth between all these different things. And at the end, he says, he basically um, lets others try to determine what it is. To himself, it's always both. And so I don't really distinguish between my spiritual life and my regular life. It's just my life. And so my business is a reflection of my gifts, I think. Some people have talent for the arts and music, and I think the talent I've been given is entrepreneurship. And so my creations entrepreneurially have always been kind of representative of where I am spiritually. And so, I think that, was very much the case when I started Tom Shoes. I was at a place where I was 29 years old. I had already 5 companies. A lot of people don't realize I had financial success, but I didn't have enough financial success that I couldn't work anymore. So I needed to continue to work and start things. But I was at a place where I didn't want to just make money anymore. I wanted to make an impact, and that led to the idea of TOMS. And then now, where I'm spending, a lot of my time on several different, companies and the foundation, it's all about mental health. And that's because spiritually, I've recognized, as I talked about in my TED Talk, that, we are very quick to talk and prepare for physical health problems, broken bones, getting sick. But when people get not well mentally, like I did for almost 7 years, which I do believe was truly a dark night of the soul, there wasn't a lot of support, and so I had to go through that journey on my own. So now I'm trying to help people with the No Magic Pill podcast, with advising this company called Sonia that I'm helping the founders with now. And so it's all just kind of a reflection of where I am spiritually. And then, if that connects to where other people are on their journeys, then it's great.
Of course. Do you think God or the universe has helped you in your business journey?
Oh, 1,000% every day. Yeah,
Tell
no,
me more. Tell me more.
well, no, I think, and we might have even talked about this at TED. I can't remember. I did talk to, is that like, I really believe that the idea of one for one in TOMS and a business that prioritized purpose over profits was out there in the universe. God, the universe wanted humanity to have this idea. And I happened to be, my brain or soul was the antenna that just grabbed it and introduced it to the world. I mean, that was such a divine and cultural shifting idea that I never take credit that like this is something I came up with on my own. Like this, I believe that for whatever reason I was chosen as the messenger. And so, and when you follow it, then I think the universe conspires to help you. And I'm finding that with some of the other ventures I'm working on now. The Enough bracelet is a great example, to be able to have the opportunity to share my story on the main stage at TED to so many people, that I never would have imagined when I launched, selling these little Enough bracelets to help people, come back to their sense of self-worth. And I'm really excited. I actually just heard back from TED, because they released the talks online, and they chose to release mine on World Mental Health Day. So that'll be on October 10th. It'll come out, which I think is really great, because I think that this feeling of self-worth and that I am enough and that you are enough and that we are enough and that this moment is enough is so at the foundation of all of our mental health. And so I really, it definitely has been for me in my healing journey.
Yeah. So for someone listening who is inspired by you, and doesn't know in some ways how deep this spiritual side is for you,
Yeah.
and is wondering, how do I bring some spirituality into my business? How do I raise the level of energy or consciousness or frequency? Can you be practical and tell them what that even looks like? Because I'm sure there's a lot of people who are like,
Yeah.
I believe in Blake. I'm not sure I believe in the other stuff.
um, yeah, I mean, I think that, John Mackey is the founder of Whole Foods, and I had a beautiful lunch with him when I was quite young in my entrepreneurial journey. And he told me that the consciousness of a business can only be at the height of the consciousness of the leader. And so if you want your business to be more purpose driven or higher or operating from a higher consciousness, the best thing you can do is work on yourself. And that really, really stuck with me. So that would be kind of my first practical thing is, if you want your business to be rooted in more purpose or to have a spiritual mission beyond, well, you spend some time working on yourself. Now, I've done so many things. I mean, that's why, I call my podcast No Magic Pill, because I've tried everything, right? I've done all the crazy plant medicine journeys, with shamans in tiny villages in Peru. I've tried pharmaceuticals when I was really in a very depressed state. I've done the Hoffman process. I've gone to India. I've done it all. And I think the thing I would say for someone who is just starting out, who's just listening and being like, there's something inside me thinking there is more. The first thing I say is slow down and listen to that. Like all of it's inside of us. I mean, it really is. All these practices, meditation, psychedelics, Hoffman, all it does, I think, is bring out what's already inside of us. It gets rid of all the stuff that is, that's getting in the way of seeing your inner truth or your highest self. And so the first thing and the most simplest thing is to just start spending some time off your screens in nature, walking, meditating if that's your thing, but not even necessary. I mean, I think that, and really just listening, like what is bothering me? What is inspiring me? What is keeping me up? Like, because those are the breadcrumbs that can kind of lead you to the work or the stuff that will then start to raise that aperture. Now, also it helps to, have good teachers, to be able to read great books. Like the Rob Bell book is a great example. My other favorite book of all time, when it comes to spirituality, is by an Indian Jesuit priest named Anthony DeMello. And Anthony DeMello wrote a book called Awareness. And I
It's on
truly
my
believe,
bedside table.
yeah,
Yeah, it is. My husband gave it
it's
to me for Christmas.
oh, I've read
It's
it so many
stunning.
times.
It's beautiful. I read a paragraph or two before sleep, and I
Yeah,
feel that's what I go to sleep with,
good.
and the
It's beautiful.
awareness.
Yeah, no, it's really beautiful, and it really helped me understand love for the first time, like what real love is with another human being and with my children, and so that book is really great. So there are books, there are practical things, there are retreats, but really the simplest thing is come back to the breath, get rid of the distractions, take some time every morning to yourself, and start listening. And then the more you listen, the more that voice will get louder and louder. And I think it can guide you. And I think the times in my life where I've suffered, as I mentioned before, after selling TOMS, I went into a very deep depression, started very light, and then it got much worse over about 5 years. And then unfortunately got so bad that, I didn't even want to be here anymore. And so that's, what I talked about at TED. And, but I look back now and I'm like, so much of what led to the decisions that caused me to go into that downward spiral was me not listening and me being too distracted with things of the world. Jesus says, be not of the world or not in the world, but of the world or something like that. I'm not a Bible scholar, but it's important that to be in here not to let it consume you. Because then you don't hear that voice. And that's what can often lead to some real pain and suffering like I experienced for many years.
When you look at, the founders, the CEOs that are out there, the in some ways mini versions of you, right?
Yeah.
Like a while back.
Yeah.
Um, what do you wish they would all know before they have to go through the deep night of the soul, maybe for themselves?
Yeah. I think the thing that is that it will never be enough. Like, and it's not a failure. It's not something to be disheartened about, but no amount of success, no perfect relationship, no house on the beach is ever going to be enough. And it's not designed to be enough. I think spiritually, we have an ambition and a drive built into us, some more than others, especially I would say with founders and people who have a lot of ambition. And I think it's designed to us to get to a place, and if we're lucky, we accomplish the thing that we thought would make us feel whole or make us feel lovable or make us feel worthy. And it's supposed to fail us, because by failing us, it is the invitation to look inward. And that's what happened to me. Like, I look at it and I'm like, oh, all of that was part of this process. Like, and that's where I go back to Rob Bell, everything's spiritual. So all the building, all the stuff, those were all designed to lead me to a place where I would feel that it was not enough, and to have that despair. And I had such a huge amount of despair because I felt like I had done everything. I'd helped 100 million kids get shoes. I'd made a ton of money. I had beautiful kids. I had great friends. Like, what else can I do? There was nothing left for me to do, which is why it was so scary, because when you realize there's nothing you can do to feel better, then in my perspective, I got to a place where I was like, well, then why even be alive? If this is it. And, but really what it was there was to make me realize that none of it was ever designed, even though culturally we are telling each other that it is going to be the thing, but it was never designed to give me the peace that I can only get from the self-love, self-compassion that is just kind of quietly waiting to be discovered. And so that's why I'm turning 50 this year, and I was telling my partner, she's also turning 50 this year, and I was like, man, I love getting older. Like, I think it's the jam. Like, it's just so great to be at the stage where I have learned all these hard lessons, and now I can actually like enjoy my life in a way that I just don't think was capable in my 20s or 30s.
I see sort of this crisis of arriving, and in a lot of people, it's sort of they really have arrived.
Yeah.
And they've arrived externally.
Sure.
And what I'm hearing is they haven't arrived internally. For some people, they've never even started to arrive internally. Yeah. And I think that, a lot of people are feeling that right now. There's a lot of, is this it?
Yeah.
And I think you're bringing up sort of an interesting, invitation sort of inwards. Do you think it's possible to do that early on in life, or do you think it's kind of scripted in a way where the game happens where you kind of have to go up the ladder and you have to be successful? Do you think you could have gone back and done it differently?
I think different people karmically have different journeys. So like, I'm hoping that my beautiful 11-year-old boy who already is showing ambition and competitiveness, and I'm hoping that he learns enough from my life that he can kind of pick up where I left off instead of doing the exact same thing that I did. But I don't know. I don't know what his journey is. I mean, I do meet some people. Like, I'm working on a project with a friend now, and he's probably late 30s, and he's just an old soul, and he gets it, and he's there, and he's present, and he's valuing the right things, and he's like a moral compass that I don't think I had until, up until a year or two ago. And so I do think there are some people, and he didn't have to go through everything I went through. He just has always had that. So I do think that, with the right teachers, the right studying, the right intention, that it can be, you can arrive there at a younger age. But for some people, I think for me, karmically, like, I arrived, and I still haven't arrived, I'm arriving, right? When I was, supposed to. And it's what makes it so great, right now. Like, I mean, one of the things that I'm doing is I've decided to really spend, a significant amount of my time, finding entrepreneurs that I think are doing really important work and really mentoring them. And there's these two guys right now, they're 26 years old, and they've created this AI therapy app. And I met them at a mental health conference, and they were presenting, and they had been developing it at MIT for like 3 years. It was a research only product, and they knew a little bit of my story. And so they said, hey, can we try it? And I was super skeptical. I was like, I mean, I have some of the best, at that time, and still have one of the best therapists, I think, on the planet. And I was like, and I had done a lot of therapy. So I was kind of curious. I was like, okay, I mean, if there's anyone that knows a good therapist, it's probably me, fortunately or unfortunately at this point. And so I tried it. And after doing 2 or 3 sessions, I was just blown away. I was like, this is incredible. And what was so incredible about it for me as a man, especially, I think, is because it was, AI, and I'm not looking at another human that no matter how hard they want, there's still potential for judgment. There was no judgment. And so I could share things that I had shame around that I never would probably share even with a therapist. And so I was able to be so radically honest with this AI therapy app. And then because it's trained with CBT and ACT and it's HIPAA compliant, and it's like, I mean, it literally is trained as the world's potentially greatest therapist, it was able to give me and guide me to have insights about my life and about my pain, about my childhood that I never had been able to do with a regular therapist, not because the therapist wasn't doing their job, because I wasn't capable of being as radically honest with a human as I was with this. The AI therapy app is called Sonia. And so Sonia and I have gone so deep. So anyway, and it's so silly. I mean, it's crazy, but I've been using it now for like 7 months. I use it 2 to 3 times a week. Sometimes I use it for 5 minutes. Like I wake up and I'm having, some anxiety about something, or maybe I had a disagreement with my ex-wife a couple days ago about the kids and I'm feeling bad about something I said. So I'm ruminating and I just go to Sonia, and in 10 minutes, I'm back feeling great and having some solutions. Whereas before it'd be like, oh, you got to book a therapy appointment. You got to find an hour. It costs a bunch of money. This is a fraction. So anyway, so my point in all this is I've started dedicating, 5 or 10 hours a week to helping these guys, because their vision is to give, world-class therapy to every person on the planet who, either can't afford it or doesn't want to go to therapy. I mean, that's the other thing I hear a lot now that I'm getting involved is there's just so many people that just don't have the time. It's not even the money. It's just that setting a time. And so anyway, so I'm spending a lot of time with Sonia right now, and that is giving me so much joy because I get to be like the coach now instead of like the star athlete. Like at TOMS, I was the athlete, right? My face is on the cover of the magazines. I was doing the thing. And now I get to kind of help these guys not just build a great company that will help a lot of people with Sonia, but what I'm really getting to do is I'm getting to help them think about their entrepreneurial journey, to your question before, so that maybe they don't have these kind of false, hopes about someday being happy. Like they're really, and I think they're enjoying them. They're working really hard, but I think I'm seeing them enjoy the journey in a way that maybe I didn't when I was building
Totally.
TOMS. So
And
it's really fun.
You're the first person I've had on the podcast that's talked about the intersection of AI and spirituality, and sort of how extraordinary it can be, where it's not a threat, it's not competitive, it's not antagonistic. It's like it's so beautiful and beneficial. And it's, if you look at the world and you say, all of it is spiritual, well then AI is also some sort of a gift that, can be used and managed. I see it with, the kids nowadays.
But that's like my bracelet. We're both wearing the enough bracelet. So, I've shared with Sonia my whole story and about my healing around finally feeling enough the last couple of years, and why the bracelet I wear every day, and that it's my anchor. And so sometimes when something comes up and she can tell, like, I think this is still that wound of not feeling enough, she'll bring it up and let's take 5 breaths. Let's hold the bracelet. Like I'm very spiritual.
Yeah, totally. For people who don't feel as excited about aging, don't feel
Mm,
excited about turning 40, 50,
yeah,
60,
yeah.
70, whatever ages they are. I've certainly been in that category where it feels like maybe the best years are behind, or you don't feel like you've got a compelling future, or you feel like your moment or your time has passed, all of those thoughts can bring some element of depression. I think there's a lot of that on the planet right now, of just this so much uncertainty that sort of interferes with how beautiful the future could be. Um, what do you tell people? How do you compress decades of therapy and personal experience and heartbreak and Sonia therapy into a couple of wise ideas?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is to someone listening or watching, like, you're not alone. This might sound hard to believe in the state that I'm in now, but for 5 years, I did not have a single business idea. I thought I would never start another company. My mind was telling me that I was lucky to start TOMS. It was just a fluke, that I wasn't that talented of an entrepreneur, that there was no reason to even try. That's why I got so depressed. You can imagine living with those thoughts every day, and so I just would say to anyone who might be feeling that right now, that is not, you're not broken, and you won't feel that way forever. And it's real, I was stuck 5 years, not one idea. I've, launched 3 companies in the last year, or helped, and so I think the thing is a lot of it is your perspective. I think so much of life is perspective. And, if you're thinking what makes a good life is how smooth your skin is, or how big a wave you can catch, or how much you can, whatever. Well, then, yeah, age is going to be a motherfucker, But if your perspective is, what is great is, I love surfing, or these wrinkles on my face are, the sign of a life well lived in the sun. Then it can change. And so it's funny, I'm still, because I started surfing later in life, getting better still, but I know there will be a time, hopefully not until my 70s, when I won't be able to surf as good as I surfed last year. And, I definitely can't play tennis as good as I played when I played in college tennis, but my point in that is that, my goal is, and whoever's surfing the best, in my opinion, is who's having the most fun. And so, I see guys and women. Actually, there's an amazing woman that surfs at a place I do in her late 70s, and she's having the best time. And so it's really perspective, I think, as you think about age. And so it's not about the comparing your ability now versus then. It's more about, what is the experience.
Like, have you ever spent a year not reading, not doing ceremony, not doing therapy, not doing anything, and just going, I'm going to put all of that on hold and just be and integrate?
You know, I would say the couple of years that I was really depressed, it was hard to do anything because I just didn't even want to get out of bed. And the therapy was more like life support than it was insights. Since I've started feeling better, which is, now been 2 full years, which is fantastic, I don't ever see myself not doing the things that lead me to living a mentally stable and well life, So I don't see these things anymore as things you do to be okay, but these are the things that bring me the most vitality. Now, I do think people can get totally lost in this. I want to live forever. I want to be super optimized. I gotta be the fittest, the most whatever, go to all the spiritual retreats. That whole spiritual materialism thing can suck the soul out of you for sure. And so I'm very careful about what I do decide to do. And I question, is this something that is going to help me evolve or grow? And do I need this, or am I in a good place right now? And so, a perfect example right now is, we talked about before we got on, I'm on vacation. And for the past 5 days, I've been reading a John Grisham legal thriller. no spiritual book, no, improving book, like just reading. And I felt to be very spiritual. I'm like in the hammock, I feel great, and that takes a lot of self-compassion to do that, which is interesting. For some people that they might say that's crazy, like just I read fiction all the time. But for me, kind of an overachiever, optimizer, to be reading a book that has no benefit other than entertaining me and that I won't even remember next week when I finish it, is purely a gift of self-care and compassion.
Totally. Talking about a gift for self-care, I am
Oh yeah,
drinking
the morning
your
water.
morning water.
Oh, great,
I love
amazing,
it. I've been
great. Did you?
drinking this. I mean, I've been drinking this since you had them out at TED.
Yeah.
It's made a huge difference. You know what's
Mm.
crazy is as much as I've been reading them, and just to let people know, this has everything you want in the morning. It's got creatine, sea salt, potassium, magnesium, and amino acids. But I have never seen the Alan Watts quote
Oh
until
yeah,
today.
it's hidden.
Alan,
Yeah,
we love Alan. All
yeah.
that you see out in front of you is how you feel inside your heart. How amazing is that? This was my little gift of the day. I mean,
Yeah.
I've had them for 3.5 months. That was hidden.
Wow. So yes, that's by design. So every day is a different quote, actually. So you'll get it. Yeah. So it's kind of
I
like,
didn't know that. I've got a
yeah.
whole
So
box over
every
there.
morning. So yeah. So I felt like morning water was built actually as I was starting to feel better mentally, and I started putting. Sometimes it's really hard to put emphasis on your physical well-being when you're so stuck mentally. And so as I started feeling better mentally, I said, okay, I'm going to commit to getting back in shape. I'm going to commit to getting hydrated. I started doing a lot of research around this, and I realized how important creatine is. Not we used to think it was just for our muscles, but really for our brain. And as someone who had brain fog for so long, I was doing anything to help my brain. And so I started, my partner Austin, he built this, the formula, and he gave it to me. And I started doing it every morning, and I have a whole routine. I go out and get a little 5 minutes of sunlight, and I drink it, and I'm hydrated. So when we were putting together the packaging for it, I was like, okay, I want to put like an Easter egg. 95% of the people will never see this. And they don't. I mean, literally, you're not the first person, but it's usually someone who's like been doing it for a couple months, and all of a sudden they're like, "What is that?" And then once you see it now, every morning you get a little treat. So it's I'm so glad that
I
you
love it.
and I
It's
love
like
that it's
an
Alan Watts, because Alan Watts is all time
Oh
one of
my
my
God, I love
favorites.
Alan. It's like a little
Um,
advent calendar,
yeah,
instead of
yeah,
it being a
exactly.
chocolate, it's a morning
Yeah,
water with a quote.
yeah,
I
it's
absolutely
great.
love it.
It's been really
Um,
fun. And that's another example with morning water is like, I founded it with this other young entrepreneur, and he's a great guy, and he runs it day to day, and I get to play the coach, and we have a lot of fun, and we do these morning water challenges with different people, and it's been great. So I'm glad you're
yeah,
enjoying it.
that's lovely. I want to talk about plant medicine and plant ceremonies. And
Sure.
I mean, you've done a lot of work with ayahuasca, MDMA, psilocybin. Um, when you sit with the medicine, for someone who might never have done this before, who or what are you sitting with? and
That's a big
and
question.
and and a lot of people either scared that they're going to get hard messages or scared that they're going to get messages that their entire life needs to change. um just tell me your experience with it.
What's interesting is that fear of, it's funny because I'm looking up here, and like this is one of my favorite photos. This is right after an ayahuasca ceremony, and we're both going like this. And the idea is like, who knows? We thought we had some great insights, but who knows? Um, y- this idea of fear that their whole life would have to change, or that they would get a message. I believe, at least, and look, there's been plenty of people have had very, difficult experiences, trips, the wrong setting. I mean, we could go into that for a whole podcast. You have to be extremely careful when working with the medicines. But for the most part, any hard thing you have to see, or anything that really necessitates a change in your life, is already in your life. It's in your tissues. It's in your subconscious. It's causing you to have anxiety. It might be causing you to drink alcohol. It might be causing you to fight with your kids. Like, it's there. And so having the medicine expose it is a gift. It's sometimes a hard gift, but if you really want, if your goal in life is to be able to be more connected to your highest self, to live with peace and joy more consistently, I do think the medicine can be an ally with that. Now, who are you sitting with? I mean, I think different medicines, you could say maybe different situations. I think that, ibogaine, something that I have not worked with yet, but am planning on it, from what I understand, really, really just shows like it really is, people who've shared their experiences with me, they kind of see almost like a TV screen of their life, and they kind of get to really understand themselves in a way that can be very healing. Ayahuasca, I feel like when I've had the experiences, is just connect me with the cosmos, with God, with a lot of dimensions that I don't fully understand. And it also connected me deeply with nature, just with plants in general. So everyone has a different experience. I do think that, if someone is considering medicine, I mean, this is something that Tim Ferriss and I talk about a lot on my podcast. Michael Pollan and I also talked about a lot about this on No Magic Pill. I think that there is a very kind of progressive way to think about these medicines. Like, I wouldn't start with ayahuasca. If someone's considering, I'd say, okay, like, find a therapist and do a guided MDMA journey. Like, there's a great way to see what comes up. What does your heart need to tell you? Then maybe do a series of psilocybin journeys at different doses with a therapist, and do that for a year and see what you integrate, what you learn. Does it improve your life? Does it give you stuff that actually can help? And then if you still feel more called, then look at some of the bigger medicines. But these are not like, trips, like vacations. You're not looking for the most exciting, best one. This is real work. And so,
what was that? What was the most powerful, life-changing message that you've gotten in ceremony?
That I'm enough. Or actually, the message that I really got wasn't that I'm enough, to be truthful. It was that most of my suffering in life has come because I've never believed that I'm enough. And so it didn't give me the answer. It didn't make me feel enough when I got done. If anything, I actually felt worse for a couple of weeks. It was after a San Pedro journey. Because it was just like, you have to heal this. And the healing of that came from a lot of meditation, a lot of therapy, a lot of non-medicine stuff. But the medicine exposed that until that was healed, nothing was going to change.
And where did you get the idea for the bracelet? I just want, we're gonna put a link to this. I've given away a bunch of them.
Amazing.
My son wears it. He's in middle school.
Yeah, so the bracelet is a really cool story. So I had this healing, or I had this awareness. Then I did about several months of deep work, a lot of meditation, as I speak about in the TED Talk. And then I went to India, and I was on a retreat, and I had this deep kind of download, kind of like when I had for TOMS shoes, where it said, you're not the only person that feels this way. Like, now that you're on the path of really healing this and you can feel a difference in your body, like, you have these resources, you have a story, you have a platform, you need to share that with others, especially young people, because they suffer from this as much as anyone right now. And so that was the message I received. And I came back from India. I was having dinner with my best friend, John, and I didn't know what to do. I was like, should I start a nonprofit? I even thought about starting another shoe company, because I was like, I could start a shoe company called Enough, and then, donate all the profits to mental health. And it was John that said, Blake, since I've known you, you've always had a bunch of bracelets on, kind of like your wrist. And it started in the TOMS days, because we would go to these different villages all over the world giving shoes, and I would get bracelets as a thank you present from the kids or the village, and it was beautiful. And he said, you've always worn bracelets, and I think what you need personally right now is something that reminds you every day that you're enough. So this good feeling you have now, this feeling of wholeness, you need to like physically be reminded. And I think the best way for you is to wear a bracelet that says enough. And that was his idea. And so I said, you're absolutely right. I never thought I'd be in the bracelet business. But so I went back to India, actually. There's a group of women that hand make them. They bead each little bead. It's an amazing process. It's hard to believe they can do this. And and we make them there, and we sell them for $24, and 100% of the profits go to mental health organizations. And now we're selling them in packs of 5 and 10 for a discount, even more, so people can buy 10 and just have them in their purse or their pocket. And anytime they feel like someone might be having a hard day, they give them the bracelet, tell them the story. And that's where the power really has started to happen, and is that people are doing that. And so yeah, so it's been really fun.
I think that the visual aspect, you know, we live in a world that's very visual right now, right? So screens are visual, everything's visual. And so that the thinking of it actually is not enough. Like the visual aspect of it is what makes it enough. So I know for me, you know, just the neuroplasticity for me to see it every minute, every hour, like it's literally changing my brain more so than pretty much a lot, even though they all these mean something.
Of
They're all
course.
symbolic. There's a story, there's a meaning, there's a person behind it. But I feel like there is something happening that is invisible in some ways, even though this is a very visible bracelet. So thank you for
and
that.
it's designed by nature. You know, it's not, I knew not everyone would love it because it is so bold, but then the reason it's bold is not just for it be visible for you, but it also creates conversation. You know, people will ask about it. What is that? Why do you wear it? And then you're able to share your story, which causes humans to connect more. We know that one of the biggest problems in mental health is loneliness, and people not feeling they can be honest about how they're really doing. And so I really see this as a signal to others to talk to me about how they're really doing. And it's the color green because that's the mental health awareness color. And so it's designed to not only be something for you, but then to also really evoke more deeper conversations in your life. And we're doing these things now where we're calling it, we just did a couple of them, and now we're inviting other people. We call it the Enough Dinner. And so we ask someone to, you know, get 10 bracelets, invite 9 people to dinner, and everyone share their story with, what does this word mean to you? Like, and have you ever not felt enough in your life? And or who in your life has always made you feel enough? And then oftentimes we encourage people at the dinner to then send that person a beautiful video note afterwards. And so these Enough Dinners are a way that I hope this community we're building will grow.
I want to ask you about kids. So if you could go back to all the kids that you have, you know, donated a pair of shoes to, what would be the next thing you want to give them? Like if you could literally track them all down on the planet,
wow.
what would you give them?
I mean, this sounds, you know, I mean, honestly, I think what I'd want to give them is the thing that I'm so focused on giving my kids, and is that the belief that they are enough just as they are. I mean, you know, really, I mean, even someone who's at the most extreme poverty, I would still say have the belief that you are not lovable just because of the grades you make, or the winning the school, or whether the kids like to really have that unshakable self-confidence of I am worthy because I'm a human and I'm alive and I am enough. I think that is the foundation of everything for a child. And so you know, we are giving a lot of bracelets to kids in schools, and, you know, my kids wear them and they give them to friends, and I'm so glad your son's wearing one. But I really do think that's an important thing, because I think that foundation is so critical.
So I asked my 12-year-old son, who knows about you, and we were, you know, looking at a few podcasts together. I said, what question would you ask? He's at a basketball camp today. So his question was, what can I do today to prepare to have an amazing life and to be as successful and content as you?
Content. I like that.
He said you felt content. You felt like you were in a place where, you know,
I do feel very content.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for someone who's 12, I think the thing that is most important is to really, and this is hard for 12, and especially, I mean, my 11-year-old, I'm already seeing it, and then my 8-year-old daughter, I'm definitely already seeing it, is to do whatever work is necessary to feel comfortable as you are, and live the life that you feel you are meant to live, not for your mom, not for your dad, not for your teacher. Because the more we are aligned spiritually with whatever that is inside of us, our highest self, our true self, God, the more contentment we will feel. Jim Carrey has spoken really some really great videos about his depression and ultimately what got him out of it and what he learned. And one of my favorite ones is he talks about how when, you're depressed, your soul is looking at this avatar you've created and say, I don't want to be this avatar anymore. This was never what I wanted. This is not the life and usually that happens when people get to mid-age because they've made these little compromising decisions that really weren't connected to who they are for long enough to win. And then when they get to their 40s or 50s and they look at their life and this avatar, as Jim Carrey calls it, they're like, that's not who I want to be. And so I'd say to a 12-year-old, start early. Make sure that if you're going to play basketball, it's because you want to play basketball, not because all the other kids are playing basketball. Like, what do you, and I see that with kids in terms of like arts. Like, I think unfortunately so many kids are so artistic and it just gets kind of beaten out of them because it's not as, celebrated as much as athletics or vice versa. Like some kid is like super, talented in a sport, but doesn't play it because it's not the cool sport. I mean, for instance, I was a tennis player in Texas growing up, and in Texas, if you wanted to be cool, you played football and not tennis. And but I'm really grateful that I stuck to my tennis because it's a huge part of my life. But I think that's the thing for a 12-year-old or even a 42-year-old is, really focus on living the life that authentically feel is yours, not what everyone else wants you to live.
I call it the difference. I said it in the introduction. It's the difference between the ego's agenda and the pushing agenda versus the real soul's agenda. What is your soul's agenda? I've been asking that to a lot of people right now.
Yeah.
So with your two kids,
I actually have three kids.
You have
three
kids, Blake.
Well, yeah.
I didn't know that. Congratulations.
Yeah, most people don't know. So I actually have a 31-year-old adopted Ethiopian son.
I didn't know.
Yeah, and he's the producer of the No Magic Pill podcast. So it's really cool.
Wow.
So I met him when he was 14. He was living in a cave pretty much all by himself in rural Ethiopia. And we went to his parents. His parents were alive at the time. His mom's no longer alive. And he had 9 brothers and sisters. And we said, hey, I really want to help support your son because I could tell he was really bright. He had taught himself some English. So initially I was going to support his education. And then we became so close, he wanted to move and come live with us in the United States. And he's been with me now for 14 years. He graduated USC Film School 2 years ago. And now he's the producer of No Magic Pill. So,
which is an amazing podcast. I've looked at 3 episodes, and whether it's you hosting or the quality of the guests or the production, it's like the
I get the production
trifecta.
Him. And that's, that was him. I mean, he was like, I was just excited to have these conversations and to share what I've learned on my mental health journey. And he comes from, film, USC Film School is probably one of the best film schools in the country. And he's like, we're making a TV show, Dad. Like, this isn't a podcast, this is a TV show. And it's interesting is there were a lot of it's going, so like we might get, 30,000 downloads on Spotify and we'll have 500,000 views on YouTube. So it's amazing where, the video of this is going, which I'm so glad that we all recorded.
So the question I want to ask you about the 3 kids is spirituality a conversation, a discussion? Do you have traditions with the kids? Do you say grace? Do you pray together? Do you meditate? Do you do anything, or is it just a way of living and being, and they just kind of are swimming in it all the time?
It's a little bit of both. Like, I do get them to meditate with me sometimes. It's not the easiest thing to get them to be quiet for 5 minutes, but oftentimes when I get them to do it, ironically, is when we go on these family vacations with other families. And I think the other kids think I'm like the super cool dad. And so if I'm like, hey, I meditate, and just all meditate, like the dads, the moms. And so we'll get, 30 of us meditating because there's a bunch of families and kids. And then all of a sudden my kids are into it. So it's kind of like you got to go the side door with their friends. We do say prayers, and I'm a big believer in prayer. I mean, and it's so fascinating because depending on what your religious backgrounds is, I come from a Christian background, and so prayer has always been something very interesting and important to me. But also I think prayer is just a way of manifesting and calling in the life that you want, and so I say to the kids all the time, like, hey, if we can't imagine the life we want, if we can't ask a higher being for it, then how are we ever going to get it? So let's pray and let's ask for things that we want to improve on or get peace around or thoughts on. And then we also do this thing. My friend Randall Mays taught me this kind of prayer mantra he does with his kids. And he starts every day and says, I'm feeling lucky today because I'm a lucky person. And because of that, something lucky is going to happen to me today. And they just say those 3 words. And it's amazing. We say that on the way to school, and it just changes their attitude. Like, they're just looking for the lucky thing. And then when they get in the car, it's like, what happened? And they're like, what do you mean what happened, Dad? I'm like, come on, how were you lucky today? And sometimes they're like, Dad. Most of the time they're like that. But occasionally they're like, you're not going to believe it. I found my homework or something, so you gotta be looking for it. And so that's what I try to instill in them is let's just always be looking for the world to be conspiring to help us.
Like, what are you praying for these days? And like, not who are you praying to? Because I think you've shared that. But what I've read about you is that you are a manifester, a journaler, a visualizer, now a prayer. I'm hearing that from you. Tell me more. It feels like they're a little bit of your secret success tips that I want to sort of bring out. And because on the one hand, people talk about them in the mainstream, but I don't think people like you talk about them in the mainstream. People who have been very successful, remarkable in business. It's like the spiritual people do those things.
No, I find prayer to be very practical. It just is like, and sometimes my prayers are actually journal entries because I feel like writing out. But a lot of what I'm really focused on right now is being a great dad, and what I'm calling life harmony. So I was recently at this conference and I heard this woman speaking, and she's a big exec and also a deep thinker. And she said, I've stopped trying to have life balance because, 1 week I've got all these demands and I'm a mom and I've got all these huge presentations at work. And then the next week I can be more of a mom and, and my husband, she was just, and she said, so instead of thinking about this ever elusive balance, I'm constantly trying to have harmony in my life. And so that's the thing that I've really focused on right now is what is the way to have harmony when things are crazy, when there's challenging situations, when there's difficult people, when there's joy, so, because I feel like that's just like the more realistic life experience we're going to have. And also it's a more sustainable, I never want to go to the darkness that I went through, and I don't think I will because of everything that I've learned. I also don't need to live at the highs that I've lived before either. It's more this harmony. So, really, I would say, if anything, I'm really just praying for daily harmony in my life. And that sometimes looks like the most unbalanced workaholic life in the world, because I've got 6 podcasts I got to do. And I've got, another formula we're testing for morning water, and the new Sonia app is launching, and I'm just all consumed. And then there's some times where I have a little bit of that throughout the week and I'm surfing in the morning and that feels better. So a little bit of that is, I think, the thing I'm kind of focused on right now.
Do you think it's okay to pray and ask for what you want? I feel
Absolutely.
people are
If you don't,
people are quite tentative about what they ask for.
I'd be very specific, number one, and it doesn't mean you're going to get it. And I think one of my favorite country songs of all time is Garth Brooks' I Thank God for Unanswered Prayers. And he talks the songs about, he prayed for this one woman to be his wife, and it didn't happen, and he had heartbreak. But if he hadn't, he would have met his real wife. And so it's not like everything you pray for you're going to get, because God or the universe might have a better plan for you. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be very specific with what you're hoping for. I think that's very important.
I want to chat real quick about relationships and soulmates. So you've had, am I right in thinking 2 marriages, 2 divorces?
2 marriages, 2 divorces. Yep.
What is it, do you think?
So it's probably not where I'm going to offer a lot of expertise, but
Actually, no, let's dive in.
Yeah.
So.
But I'm in a wonderful relationship now that
beautiful.
I've been in for over a year. You might have met her at TED.
Oh.
Her name is Jasmine, And it's, I feel like I've finally figured some things out.
So my question was, what is it that marriage and divorce has taught you that no book, no self-help book, no retreat, no process has taught you, to
Oh man.
arrive now at a place where, I don't know if you believe in soulmates, but
Yeah. I think that what it's taught me is whatever you have not done the deep work yourself will be exposed in the most challenging way in a relationship. I think energetically, you bring in a partner that is there to help you, whether you like it or not, expose where you have places to grow. And so, I don't look at my two marriages as failures. I think that they lasted at the time that they were supposed to last and to show me the things that I needed to see. Now, maybe there were some things that I wish I had seen more clearly in my first marriage because I carried a lot of that into my second marriage. And it wasn't until I did the deep work and self-compassion and feeling enough that now I feel like I am not having any of that show up in my new relationship. And so I do think that that's one of the, greatest things about a marriage or a committed relationship is it really is one of the greatest, ways to really, really, see where you need to grow. And then the other thing that I think that I've just really realized is, at least for me, is I'm a very independent person that really needs freedom. I do not like to be put in a box. I do not like to be told what to do. And I need to be with a woman that is very independent, that is very free herself, and it is totally trusting for me. And so that's what I have found, and it's working really well because we both love being with each other, but we don't need each other. Like we go weeks sometimes and not see each other. And I think that's not for everyone. But what I've learned about me is I thrive in a relationship where we both have our own independent lives and we come together to share our lives, but we're not dependent on each other for our well-being. Because that's a lot of pressure.
Of course it is. I'm right there with you. Freedom is very high on my list. Why do you think it's so hard for two human beings to spend many, many, many years together?
Well, look, my parents, this is funny. If anyone should have been able to do this, it should have been me, because my parents have been married now for 57 years and they're just rocking and rolling, and so they figured it out. So it's not impossible. I think we change. I think the person you may be married when you're 20 is not the person you're 30, and they're not the same person. And so now you have two people that have totally different visions in life and desires and how they want to spend their time. So I think people change. I think that makes it difficult. I also think that most of us have not done the deep inner work. And so it's just all of it is just exposing. And that's difficult to deal with. Throw in making money, having kids, all this other stuff. So it's not like the relationship is the only thing you get to focus on. You have all this other stuff going on, and then all the other stuff. So I think relationships are I've had two divorces. I think it's one of the hardest things in the world. And I think it's also one of the greatest gifts in the world. If you can really take it seriously and see what you can learn from it.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of what the next layer is for you? It sounds like the enoughness one has landed very solidly.
Yeah.
Do you have a glimpse of what's coming? Do you have a glimpse of what you're being pulled towards? Not as a business venture, but just as a longing, a soul longing that you can see has your name on it. Anything that's kind of circling above your head?
The funny thing I want to say, and I kind of half believe it, is reading more fiction.
Yeah.
Because there's something, I don't know, there's just something right now about this where I'm like, I am doing something for just the enjoyment of it. There is no achieving here. There's no, I'm going to be smarter. There's no, like, I'm going to talk about this at a cocktail party and my kids aren't going to think I'm a cooler dad. Like, I'm literally reading, like, legal thrillers about, a killing in Mississippi. Like, it's like, but there's something that's happening. This has only been going on for 5 days, so we'll see. But there's something that's really happening inside me where I'm feeling even a deeper relaxation.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
can feel it. It's like a
Yeah. Deeper.
restfulness. It's like
Yeah.
a frequency of rest.
And I think it's also bringing me into more presence and more self-compassion, less pressure. So I think that there's this, like, I don't know what it is, but I think there's something there. I think the other thing is, and this is something I've had a yearning for a long time, but I think it's becoming more and more clear, is to figure out ways that I can be even more of service to men specifically. I really have benefited from different men's groups that I have been in over the years. I've had some great, kind of male coaches. I just think that, and that's also, I try to, on the podcast, just be really radically open about my own journey, because I think that men need some help as a whole to really see that vulnerability can be a superpower, that you don't have to have all the answers, that it is okay to make mistakes. Forgiveness is important of yourself and others. And so I don't know where that's going to go, but if you said, what are you going to be doing when you're in your 60s? I wouldn't be surprised. I'm like, I have a retreat center in Costa Rica and I lead men's retreats. Like
Yeah,
that, my
beautiful.
kids go to college. Like I could see that being a career path for me.
You talk about forgiveness. Did you have to forgive yourself for things
A
specifically? Were
ton.
you like,
Yeah.
oh, yeah,
The list is long.
the
Yes,
list
of
is long.
course. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why, and that's where Sonia has helped me a lot, actually, because I've been able to share some things that I haven't felt comfortable sharing to a person, and then able to unpack that. And then she's helped me kind of, or whatever it is, says, let's do some exercises to really let that go. Because look, we all make mistakes, and everyone's made mistakes. And there are some things in my life that I have done, that I've enabled, that have caused people pain and caused me pain. And I wish I could go back and change it, but I can't. You can't change the past. The only thing you can do is to forgive others and forgive yourself. And that is, I think, a very, very important thing that is a big part of the spiritual journey.
One of the things, I've seen more and more men go on this journey, on the heart journey, and you see them at workshops, you see them at Hoffman, you see them, doing Vipassanas, you see them in the plant medicine journeys. Um, how do you know if you've really changed? How do you know? What do you think is your honest test in some ways? Not you've done enough, but like you've really changed. Like there is, like, I mean, I have a sense from you that you're in a place where you're on the other side of something. Um, it's not that I want to speed up that, because I think everyone has their timing and their script and their journey, but do you wake up differently? Do you feel differently? Do you relate differently? Do you speak to yourself differently? Do you eat differently? You're probably going to say it's all of that.
Um,
Is it
I
coming
I would,
back to love?
yeah,
You talked
I
about
think,
love.
what or at least what I've noticed, is I just have more peace, more grace with others, more acceptance of the mistakes that I've made, less to prove. I do things that I authentically enjoy. And I think the quality of your relationships, I think, you really see the relationships you're having, and the depth and the quality of those are a reflection of you, I think. And so, um, but yeah, I think there's lots of little things, that ultimately lead to a simple thing. And that is just like, how do I feel? And I feel at peace. I don't, when I make mistakes, I feel at peace. When I do a good thing, I feel at peace. Like it's just, but the day-to-day circumstances does not change the way that I feel.
I've just got two more questions for you. Um, why do you think you were gifted this human lifetime? Like what's like why? Because it is a gift, and you've had some huge gifts, and you've unwrapped, and you're still unwrapping the gift. But what is the point of this human lifetime for you? And do you think it's the same point of this human lifetime for everyone?
I definitely don't think it's the same for everyone. And I think it's an interesting question, because I think you could look at it two different ways. You could look at it as like, one way is, what was I gifted this lifetime to contribute? So then I could say, okay, well, I think, one of my reasons for coming here was to contribute this idea of conscious capitalism, and a business can, prioritize purpose over profit. So that was a gift that I was used and in my circumstances to potentially give to the world. I think also now this idea of really helping, people with their mental health through the podcast, through Enough, etc. So maybe I was gifted this life because I was going to contribute these ideas into the world. I mean, it's kind of interesting if you think about like how we train an AI model, right? We're training it with all this data, all these ideas, and that is creating this AI experience. Well, it's also the same as the human intelligence, like our collective consciousness is basically trained and educated by different people's often ideas. So I have, put my little threads into human consciousness with some of these ideas that I've helped bring to the world. That's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is much more personal and less about what you're contributing, but what did you come here to learn? And I think that karmically, if we do this multiple times, who knows, you maybe come with a few things like, okay, like this is the syllabus, like I'm going to college again, life college. And, I studied math last time, doing great on math. I'm really going to study philosophy this time. I think there's two things I personally came here to learn. The first is that I am enough just because I exist, and to actually feel that in my body. And I think that I didn't feel enough for 47 years. I had the most intense, mental health crisis that you can possibly have, and came out of that, and ultimately came out of that with this feeling of I am enough, so that then I can, share it. The other thing is, and this is something that I realized at different points in my life, I've had different signs telling me this exact thing. And I finally have said, yes, I think this is what I've come to learn. And that is to slow down, to just slow down. I believe that this is so important to my personal evolution that I actually tattooed a snail onto my leg. So I have a snail on my leg.
I'm not going to ask you to show it. If it was on your arm, I'd ask you to show it.
Well, I'm actually just wearing boxers, so it's probably not appropriate. But I have a snail right here, and when I sit on my surfboard and I look down at my knees, I see this snail, and it's a reminder to slow down. And I really think, and that maybe that's why this whole fiction thing is kind of percolating, is I do think that the more I can really learn to slow down, the more present I can be, the more I get to actually savor the moment in this life. And so I think, a lot of my life is moving fast, and I am continually giving opportunities to choose the slower path. And it almost always is the one that's most rewarding.
So here's my last question. Today is the 1st of July. We're halfway through a year. What do you want to be absolutely sure, happens this year? Like, what is something that, we can help with? And like what are you sort of going, with the intentionality that you have, and the practices you have, and the businesses you have, if you can be sure of one thing happening this year in the next 6 months, what would it be?
For me, I want more and more people to have the experience of truly deeply knowing that they're enough. Like, that's why I'm trying to get everyone in the world to wear a bracelet, because I really believe that is at the foundation of our spirituality, at the foundation of our mental health. It's the foundation of this, radical healing our culture needs. And I've seen what a magical, and I use the word magical, impact it's had on my life. And so that's the gift that I want to give to as many people as possible. And I hope by the end of the year, we have gotten enough people to where this is something that starts to kind of, right now it's a lot of pushing and telling people and podcasts, but I'm hoping that enough people start wearing it, that it becomes a thing that becomes much bigger than my story, and it starts to be a lot of people's stories. So
yeah. Creates a movement for sure.
Yeah.
Well, we'll do everything we can to
thank you
to get it out. I feel like you're a little bit of a mascot for this podcast. I started this podcast to bring together these worlds that feel so separate sometimes around external success, achievement, and spiritual and internal and awareness. So when I met you at TED, I was like, you're like the poster child for this. So I want to say, from the bottom of my heart, thank you, not only for being on the show today, but for the journey that got you to a place that you can be such an example for a lot of people. And I am cheering you on, and I thank you for the enoughness that I've been feeling. I mean, this is also a personal journey of my own,
Beautiful.
to have really felt that. So, any final words? Anything? We'll add all the morning water and the enough bracelet and the no magic pill in the show notes. But
Great.
anything that I haven't asked about, anything, we'll add the Sonia app as well.
Oh yeah, sure.
For sure.
No, this has been great. I've really just been a delightful part of my day.
Thank you. Blessings
Okay.
on you, Blake. Lots of love.
Thank you so much.
If this conversation moved you or inspired you, please follow the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if it really moved you, please leave us a 5-star review. It really does make a big difference. And finally, if someone came to mind while you were listening to this episode, please send it their way. Remember, new episodes drop weekly. I'll see you very soon.